Hi, my name is Roger Gonzalez. I'm a professor and chairman of the Engineering Education and Leadership Department at the University of Texas at El Paso. Today, I'd like to kind of introduce the topic of who gets to graduate, especially how those roles are playing in the type of institutions, the type of students that come from certain economic different backgrounds, and how that plays a role in access to higher education. Let's start off with talking about student success. At the University of Texas, where I work in El Paso, we are essentially what we call an open access university. That means that if you graduate from high school, regardless of what your scores may be on the SAT or SAT, you're still allowed to be a student at the university. We believe in allowing access for students to have an education regardless of their background so that we can help them continue in society to be productive members of society. So this is our campus. We're in the high desert of West Texas. We sit about 4,000 feet next to Juarez, Mexico, right next to the border, and where the Sun Bowl is. And it's a very tri-state, two-nation border that has a lot of both Hispanic and American influence. So let's talk a little bit about UTEP just real quick. UTEP is part of the University of Texas system. We have about 25,000 students and offer 21 PhD programs with a research portfolio of about $300 million a year. The student profile at UTEP is 80% Hispanic, and 85% of those students come from El Paso County. 5% of those students are Mexican nationals. That means that they are students that have a Mexican citizenship, but they cross the border or they're residential in El Paso to exist. So most of the Hispanic students at UTEP are American citizens that are there but living in El Paso County. So they don't come from much outside El Paso County. Just over half, 51% of our students are first generation students, first generation in their family to be in college. 70% of our students work at the same time that they're attending college. 95% commute back and forth. It's a commuter college. And because they're usually local and they grew up there, they're commuting anywhere from 10 to 30, 40 miles a day. And about one third, just over a third, 37% of the households, so the students come from households that make less than $20,000 a year. So that's significant from an income perspective. We tend to look at things from a needs-based approach. In other words, we look at from an asset-based approach, we tend to look at things of what assets does a student bring to the table, right? In other words, rather than focusing on imposed standards and deficits that students may have because of their educational background or their scores, we tend to look at what existing capacity the students have and what resources that they have to bring to the table to enhance the education that they're going to get at UTEP. We really value community members as assets and contributors to what's going on in the city. And we really want to be proactive rather than reactive in the things that are going on in their lives. We really like to acknowledge them as community experts. You know, this is where they spent all their lives growing up. This is where they've learned to survive and live and make do. And so we really like to be able to use that in our community because the university sits in the community that we want to be highly integrated, not just existing from an academic perspective. And that's a very different approach that we take as opposed to many of the institutions across the United States. So most of our students are bilingual and biliterate in Spanish and English. Most of them have a very strong binational orientation. Most of them cross the border regularly throughout the year. Many of them are highly engaged in the community. They're usually globally aware because they understand what's going on in the US and they understand what's going on in Latin America. So they understand the differences between nation states. They're pretty resourceful. Because they tend to be low income, they learn how to make things happen without having the income to necessarily always just go solve it by throwing money at it. They're very practical, they're industrious, and they're very, very entrepreneurial in what they try to get done. So we really do have a three-part student approach. We really not only have academic outcomes that we want our students to achieve, we have institutional outcomes that we want to achieve as a university but we blend those to be able to come up with a holistic outcome. So students not just get an academic education, acquiring knowledge, but we get them to be able to enhance their own skill sets, their own natural assets to be more effective as they go out after their graduation. So I'd like to show you a study. This was by the Brookings Institute. And the Brookings Institute looks at social mobility student access and the leaders in equal access to higher education. According to the Brookings Institute, UTEP was the #1 university in the United States for social mobility. It looks at the median family income, which is $42,000, and the share of students in the top 20% of income is 11.4%, where the students from the bottom 20% is 28%. So our demographic of what's happening with our student income is very, very low from the lowest quartile of income because of the open access and because El Paso tends to be one of the counties in the state of Texas that has a lower per capita income than most of the other counties in the state of Texas. So, and the fact that we're a research university makes that very, very interesting, that we can still be a Carnegie One research university and at the same time be able to have open access to students. That many people feel that's a conundrum, but we believe you can both have access and excellence occur at the same time. So if you look at just a general graph about admissions selectivity, you'll notice on the graph on the left-hand side that non-competitive schools have an average graduation rate of about 27%. Where highly competitive or most competitive schools have a graduation rate of 82%. That is not surprising. What's really interesting is when you look at UTEP, the two numbers for the fall of 2009 and the fall, and those two bars in the green, you'll see that our graduation rate hovers between about 65%, which is closer to the most competitive schools and the non-competitive schools, even though getting into UTEP is open access in the process. So you would think that our graduation rates would mirror that non-competitive schools more closely than most competitive schools, but you see that that's not the case. So I guess the question is, how do we do that in some sense? So we have found out through our own experience and the Lumina research studies that preparation and engagement do predict success. So we believe that the positive effect is we look at how engaged were students in high school, right? In other words, we do look at GPA, we do look at high school rank, but we look at engagement. Were they involved in sports? Were they involved in clubs? Those type of things. We look at student attendance and engagement in the classroom, right? And we know that those are associated with success in the process. We also know that the negative effects is failing a course, especially during the first term. We can identify that if we can get a student to be successful during the first 2 terms, the fall and the spring semesters of their first year, that significantly increases their likelihood of success. And just like failing a course during those first 2 terms really decreases their likelihood of success. We also understand that if a student has large external demands put on them, like working 30, 40 hours a week at the same time that they're going to school, that school suffers, their grades suffer. And that means that they'll likely, their likelihood of success decreases significantly. So we try to address that. And one of the creative ways we try to address that is to try to give them employment opportunities on campus so that they're on campus, not just to be able to go to school, but be able to work simultaneously. So we've put in a lot of effort, a lot of funds to be able to do that, especially for our low-income students that need to work. What we have found is that what does not predict success is ethnicity, their household income, their parental educational level did not really explain success in our particular case. Just like SAT and SAT scores did not explain success in our particular case. So let's talk about social mobility. Social mobility is related to taking a student from the lowest income quartile and then moving to the highest income quartile. It's just a good way to be able to quantify that. So if we look at those values, just broadly speaking on this graph, you'll see that Cal State Los Angeles has a 9.9% upward mobility success rate, which is the best in the country. I need to explain 9.9%, so just kind of hold that thought for a while. And you can see that UTEP falls at about 6.8%. There's many different types of schools in the United States, from highly private selective schools to small community colleges and then public universities, which is what the University of Texas at El Paso is. What's really important to note is that the average college upper mobility success rate is 1.9%, right? So if you're above that, you're above the average, versus there's many schools that are significantly below that. And we'll get more into how do we calculate these percentages. But I just want to give you a global perspective before we dig into the details. If you look at Texas, right, and we look at economically disadvantaged students enrolled in higher education in Texas, what you see here is a success rate that these students have when they go to these schools that you see at the bottom of the graph. That are universities in the state of Texas. So what you see here is that you'll see that UTEP, which is the orange bar on the right, has a success rate of these economically disadvantaged students of 55.8%. So over half the students that come to UTEP from economically disadvantaged backgrounds actually not only enroll, but they graduate from the university within a 6-year period. So let's talk about this study. We're going to spend a lot of time on this study, and I won't get into all the details, but I really recommend, if you really want to get into the details of how these numbers are calculated, I suggest you go to the National Bureau of Economic Research. The website link is on the bottom. If you'd like to, you can download the paper, and it's significant, and it gives you the details on how these numbers were determined. So this is really about the role of colleges, that they play in intergenerational mobility. So let's talk about that. If we look at Harvard University, and this is a graph that shows the percent of students that come from the individual quartiles of income, parent household income. If you see this, at Harvard University, this is during the 1980s timeframe, students born in the 1980s, 3% of the students at Harvard come from the lowest quintile of economic, of their parents' economic status. If you look at the top quintile, you'll see that 70% of the students at Harvard come from the top 20% of the parent income situation in the United States. What's really interesting is that of the parents with the top 1% of household income, they have 15% of students coming from 1% of this of parental income, which tells you that they're very focused on not only getting students to success, but that those students to success are coming from higher quartile incomes from parental situations, that the parents are usually pretty highly educated, they have resources, they have access to things that helps their students be prepared. So just as a snapshot, this is where Harvard would be for the, like I said, students born between 1980 and 82. If we look at this now for Ivy League plus colleges, so Ivy League means Ivy League schools in the US plus Chicago, Stanford, MIT, and Duke. If you take all those schools together, you'll see as a line item what percent of students go to those schools. So you see that very low percentages from like 0 to 60 percentile rank, and then about 80, the last quintile really starts picking up, right? What you notice from here is that 14.5% of students of these Ivy League plus schools come from the top 1% of parental income, household income. What's even more insightful is that 13.5% of these students come from the bottom 50% of household income in the United States. So there's actually more percentage of students at Ivy League plus colleges from the 1 percentile range than they are from the entirety from the bottom 50 percentile, which is an interesting aspect that you see for the Ivy League schools plus. So let's talk about how these plays out in 4 selected schools: Harvard, Berkeley, SUNY Stony Brook, and Glendale Community College. These Harvard's obviously Ivy League. UC is a very flagship state program, state university in the United States. Stony Brook is kind of middle of the range public institution, and then Glendale is a community college that serves open access and enrolls a whole bunch of students. If you look at by quintile, you'll see that, for example, Glendale Community College has the majority of their students come from the lowest quintile household income, right? And that decreases as the quintile of household income increases. In other words, the top 20% has the lowest percentage at Glendale Community College. You see the opposite effect occur like at Harvard, in which we just saw in the process. So that's important to note because that tells a lot is where are the students going at which universities based on their household income. If you then look at this mobility card, you see that the student success rates, right, between, let's say here, which we have Columbia and Stony Brook, you'll see that the success rate is not significantly different between what's happening at these two schools. And you'll see that access, right? You'll see that obviously Stony Brook has many more students that come from the lower quintiles than the higher ones, but yet their success rate is what we would call comparable to what you would see at Columbia University, which has a significant percentage of students that come from the top quintile of household income. So let's talk about how this is calculated. And this is going to be a quick overview. Like I said, the paper will again tell the details. We have a thing called mobility rate. The mobility rate is equal to the success rate, right, of the students times the access. So in other words, you take, for example, if you take the example of Stony Brook, it's 8.4%. They have a success rate of the lowest quintile of 51.2%. But only 16.4% of their population comes from the lowest quintile. So if you take the percentage of students from the lowest quintile and you multiply that times the success of those students at lowest quintile, that's how you end up with a mobility rate, okay? So it's important to understand that it's a combination of those two numbers because we're going to use that number quite a bit as we plot it. So we just use that basically as an accounting measure rather than causal effect. We're not trying to do cause and effect. We're just trying to measure what's happening. So if I was to plot those two, Columbia and Stony Brook, you would see on this graph, on the vertical axis, you see a success rate. On the lower axis, you see as the percent of parents in the bottom quintile, okay? And so what you see here is the mobility rate is where the dot exists, right, when you plot those two universities together. So you'll see that obviously Stony Brook has a higher percentage of students in the lowest quintile, and they have a slightly lower success rate. But Columbia has a better success rate, but the percentage of students that they take from the lowest quintile is very, very low. So those are two schools. What I want to show you next is if we plotted every university in the United States. This is what this graph would look like if we plotted what's the mobility rate of every university in the United States. If we get into this a little bit more, you'll notice that there's certain what we call deviations that occur. The blue dots are the Ivy League Plus schools, which they do have a tremendous success in their lowest quintile students, but they have so few of them, right, in the process. That's why they're kind of clustered at the top left. If you look at schools that have a lot of students, for example, in the bottom quintile, but they're not very successful, they'd be clustered at the bottom right. Where you really would want to be is as high as possible to the right if you can be, right? And so what I point out here is that's where UTEP's at. That dot happens to be UTEP, of where we sit on the mobility rates. So you see that we have about 28% of our students come from the lowest quintile, but our success rate is about 35%, and that's why that would be on that. So that just gives you kind of a global perspective on mobility rates. Anyway, what's important to understand about that is that it's just an objective measure to some extent on how students move from one quintile to another. In other words, I'm a child that grew up in a parent household income from the lowest quintile, but now I would certainly be in the top quintile. The issue is what happened in that process still has to be answered. And so if we're going to really be able to understand how income and disparity impacts our ability to make an educated community, we got to understand beyond that what makes certain schools have more success, even though their level of population in the lowest quintile is important. So anyway, thank you for that. I really recommend you should read the article. It has incredible information. Thank you.